Hi everyone, my name is Lou and I work for the Environment Centre NT, and today's webinar has been put together by our ECNT volunteers, and we'll be taking a look at Gamba grass and will it change the top end forever. We are joined by a range of hosts and panel members this morning, and the facilitators are David Liddle, who is an ecologist, and myself. And our panel today includes
Natalie Rossiter-Rachor from Charles Darwin University, Margaret Towers from Bushfires NT, Andrew Spiers, who's a landholder and ex-ranger. We've got Deborah Moyle from the Litchfield Tourism Association. We've got Roni Opden from the Weeds Branch, who's pre-recorded in an interview with Dave, which you'll hear. Mitch Hart, and I've made an error on the screen there. That was my fault. So it's Gamba Grassroots and from Pew Charitable Trusts. Hopefully I've got that right. We've got Rob Wood from Ethical Adventures Tours, but we do have also Greg Miles, who's a landholder and also an ex-ranger.
And I guess we're going to be answering some key questions today, which includes Gamba grass, what is it? What it's doing to our native plants and animals and the landscape, and what the potential things it could be doing include. The relationship between Gamba and fire, Gamba and tourism, landholders' experiences. We're going to hear what the NT Weeds Branch have to say about Gamba grass, and some cutting edge research. And yeah, an overall panel discussion.
All right, thanks, Lou. So yeah, so Dave Liddle here, and well, I guess talking here, but also in the image there. Look, my introductory little bit is actually just to very briefly touch on what Gamba grass is. I mean, there's a whole history about Gamba grass coming to the top end, being introduced for pastoralism, coming from Africa. Look, these images in front of you now, that's me standing there next to a fairly typical mature clump of Gamba grass. So if there's no other aspect of what you can, I guess, to recognise Gamba grass, is it's just huge. I mean, it just dwarfs anything else that we have in terms of our native species. And I guess we'll talk more about fire and fuel loads later on, and that becomes very evident. Of course, grass identification, and there's a lot of, well, plant identification generally, then there's a lot of focus on the reproductive parts, and you can see me there pointing out the seeds. So the seeds are fairly small, a bit fluffy, and sort of can be dispersed by various mechanisms, a bit of wind, a bit of animal dispersal, and whatever. And of course, most importantly, by people. In terms, all right, so I've mentioned the robustness of Gamba grass. I mean, the leaves are big. Now this is a fairly dried up leaf. This photograph was only taken a week or so ago, but one of the things that always strikes me about the leaves is they have a very prominent white midvein. They're not the only grass in the top end with a prominent white midvein, but they certainly do. This particular one, this is a fairly old leaf. As you can see, it's drying up, and it's actually lost quite a bit of its hairiness. But one of the other things that stands out to me about Gamba grass is just how hairy it is. And here's a view of some of the stems, and you can see there, just, you know, it is a very hairy grass. And so here's a picture. Well, this was taken in suburban Darwin, actually, and yeah, this is a stand of Gamba grass. I mean, it can be thinner, can be thicker than this, but what I'd particularly like people to take on board from this image is just how much fuel is there. I mean, you know, sort of, almost sort of waist deep fuel, and obviously it's going well over my head, 3 or 4 meters tall in total. But there's just a massive amount of fuel associated with Gamba grass. And here's a couple of images courtesy of CDU and bushfires that sort of show, well, visually show the effect of that in terms of flames and fire and fire intensity. So the top left is a fairly typical dry season fire with native grasses and native plant species fuel load. and the bottom right is a Gamba fire. And you can actually see in that image there's somebody in the distance here. I mean, it's just massive fires that we get from Gamba. I mean, the effect of these hotter fires is actually to take out those woody plants. So in Northern Australia, we've got this amazing savanna country that extends from Queensland across the Territory and into the northern Western Australia, so into the Kimberley. And sure, there's a bit of modification, but a lot of it's relatively intact in terms of a sort of functional ecosystem. And in a global sense, then what we've got across Northern Australia is actually of international significance. So, and if we talk about or look at actually Gamba grass and the fires that support taking out the trees in this landscape, then it's a huge impact. It's a huge impact on the environment. It's certainly a huge impact on livelihoods and lifestyles. I mean, whether you're a person in Darwin that goes bush for a weekend, or whether you're a landholder that's trying to manage country for carbon farming, or whether you're trying to run a tourist business or whatever, there are all these really, really big impacts on livelihood. So it is just a huge issue. Look, one of the ideas that I'd like people to think a bit about is actually this big picture issue about Gamba grass control, and what this diagram is basically illustrating that as time goes by, then invading weeds become harder and harder to control. I mean, basically, when they first arrive in the landscape, well, I guess the best protection is actually just to stop them coming in. But if you detect them and jump on them quickly, then eradication becomes quite feasible. And somewhere up that curve, and people become more and more aware of it, and then eventually it gets to a stage where with current resources anyway, then it becomes too big an issue. And so I guess one of the things I ponder about is actually where we are on that curve, and I actually think it probably varies across the top end. I mean, certainly much of the top end, certainly, and I guess the issue of management zones will come up a bit later on, but certainly for much of the top end, then Gamba grass is only just arriving, and so there's huge scope to actually prevent or eradicate. Some other areas of the top end, I think it's some of the areas closer to Darwin, then it really is a question, is eradication possible? And I guess to me that really comes down to how much resources is put in. So I find that a really useful diagram for when I'm trying to think about Gamba grass and what's practical. But certainly I'd like to make the point that for much of the top end and much of a potential distribution of Gamba grass, then we're in a really, really strong position to prevent it getting there and to eradicate it. But it does require a whole of community effort to do so. Natalie, perhaps if I stop screen sharing, can I pass it across to you? And Natalie's been working on Gamba grass for years, has a huge knowledge about Gamba grass, and is in a really good position to tell us about the impacts of it.
Okay, so thanks everyone. My name's Dr. Natalie Rossiter-Rachor. I'm a senior researcher here at the School of Science at CDU, and together with Associate Professor Sam Setterfield, we've been working on Gamba grass for over 20 years now, and researching about Gamba grass, the biology of the plant, the impacts, and how we can better manage other species. Yep, so Gamba grass is currently mainly distributed in the NT. It is mainly around the Greater Darwin region. It's increasing over in Queensland, and there's only a small amount in WA. So the yellow part is the potential distribution. The green is where it currently is. The yellow is where it could be if it was left unchecked and there was no management into the future. Yep, so the potential distribution, it is that whole arc across Northern Australia. And we're certainly seeing over in Queensland that it is increasing fairly rapidly. They're about 10 years behind us, but there are areas where people didn't think that Gamba grass would grow over there, that it was too cold, but it certainly is increasingly spreading across Northern Australia. So the good news is we're only in the very early stages of invasion. No matter how bad we think it is now, it's only early days. So the thing about Gamba grass is that it produces lots of grass every year. And when that grass dries out, it creates fuel loads for fires. So that dry matter, it's like putting on more wood onto a fire. So the more grass you have, the more fuel you have for that fire. And a lot of the very early work that we did was just about quantifying how much fuel there was. So we knew that in areas with sorghum, with native grasses, there was sort of around 1 to 2 hectares, at the very most up to 6 tonnes per hectare of grass sitting on the ground. That's on a very, very long unburnt native grass site. But in some of the Gamba grass sites, we were having fuel loads up to 30 tonnes per hectare. And that means that those sites, we actually had to cut our way into that site. It was so thick we couldn't actually walk physically into that site. So more fuel equals changed fire regimes. So as I said, that analogy about more wood on your fire, so the more grass you have, same sort of thing, the hotter your fire will be. So normally we see an amount of heat of around 2,000 kilowatts per linear metre. So that's the amount of heat that fire would put out. But with Gamba grass, we've actually measured that these fires can be up to 48,000 kilowatts of energy put out per linear metre of that fire front. So this is just well and truly beyond the realms of anything that we would normally see. And this is what leads to the big impacts that we're seeing on biodiversity. So this is a photo from Bushfires NT. So what we started to see with all that fuel, all that biomass there to burn, that it started to really change the types of fires that we're seeing in the savannas. So very early on we realised that the types of fires were changing, they were becoming much hotter, much more faster moving, and even in that early dry season we've measured really hot fires in the last week of May and the first week of June. So that's the beginning of the dry season. So that's at the beginning of the dry season where the weather's pretty good really, but as it gets into the dry season, the fire weather changes. So this means it's more conducive to fire. So it's drier, the fuel's drier, and it's generally windier. So by the time you get to the end of the dry season, it means that the Gamba grass fires are really at that extreme end, and they're much more like forest fires at that point. So huge flames, very fast moving, truly scary fires. So we've spent years and years measuring what these fires do to trees and biodiversity in general. So we've found that we've been actually tracking a number of sites over many years, and we've found that the Gamba grass is killing the trees. There are some sites that we've got down near Bachelor where we started off with native savanna and it was invaded by Gamba grass. And as the fires, as it's repeatedly burnt, it kills the trees, and some of our sites don't have a single live tree left. So this is absolutely a scenario that could be played out across the savannas of Northern Australia. And look, to be honest, as a member of the community, it's actually really upsetting when you're going through these landscapes, because the fires have changed these landscapes, and that they will never, ever be the same. So this is why we need to get in early and change what's happening. We need to get in and manage Gamba really early and stop this happening. So as I said, as the fires come through with the Gamba grass, it kills the trees. With repeated fires, the dead trees then fall, and over time they're consumed by fire. So you get to the point where it's just a huge monoculture of Gamba grass. There's no trees, there's no even logs on the ground. It doesn't even look like there was any trees there to start with. So you start to get this huge, it almost looks like a big paddock of sugarcane, and there's very little biodiversity left in those sites. And again, this is exactly what could play out in really large areas of savannas if we don't do something soon. And again, it's not just the trees. So Gamba grass reduces the plant diversity at the ground level. So you generally just have Gamba and maybe 1 or 2 ground species. There's large amounts of erosion, and we're working on quantifying that at the moment. They burn all the way down to the creeks. So you burn all that fire-sensitive riparian vegetation. And, we see in the field really dramatic impacts on fauna, but we're trying to, in the next couple of years, do more research onto this. But again, it's really distressing stuff to see this play out in real time, and it happens so quickly. So given that Gamba is a big threat to trees and plants in general and even fauna, it really is a major threat to conservation areas. So this is work that Sam Setterfield and Vanessa Adams did in 2014 together with Weeds Branch and TNRM. So they mapped the extent of Gamba grass in the Litchfield National Park and Kamali Shire. So the important bit to take home from here is the red is 50% cover of Gamba grass. This was actually done by helicopter survey. So the red is the highest density of Gamba grass. And this is actually increasing over time. And actually, in 2014, it was surveyed that 20% of Litchfield National Park had Gamba. So there hasn't been a survey, a full, extensive, systematic survey since 2014 because of financial limitations, but we're hoping to do this again in the near future. But again, it highlights the threat. Gamba is spreading in Litchfield. This is a huge threat to the park, to tourism, and potentially people's lives. So we need to get onto Gamba and manage it quickly. So in the small photo on the right-hand side, you can't quite see it well, but that beautiful green lawn, what looks like a beautiful green lawn, is actually just Gamba grass, and that's a photo aerial shot from Litchfield National Park. And again, we're already starting to see tree death occurring in Litchfield National Park. So it's a big threat. We need to get onto it quickly, and we need to have a really comprehensive strategic plan to manage it. So we know that Gamba is only in the very early stages of invasion, and that it's a very significant risk to biodiversity, and we need active management urgently to protect not only biodiversity, but also people's lives. Thanks, Dave. I'll hand it back over to you.
Dave, it's Andy. Do you mind if I just show very briefly the slides showing the spread in the last 15 years? If you see the difference from 2000 to 2015, I'll just play that again. You can see the red expand. That shows you the spread. And that comes from counting the cost from Gamba grassroots document.
That's a good point, Andy. And I know because I actually started my honours in 2001 it was. At that point, I was working on Gamba grass. At that point, there was so little Gamba grass that I actually had trouble finding enough. I'm talking about in the top end. I had trouble finding enough to have study sites. 4 years later, by the time I started, no, 3 years later, by the time I was in the middle of my PhD, I had trouble finding native grass sites. It had happened so quickly, and the conversion had changed over from predominantly native grass in many areas to predominantly Gamba grass. So it was really quick, and that's what I was saying too, like the change in fuel loads and invasion and the changes in fire and how that impacts on trees is so rapid. It's almost hard to believe that it could be that quick.
Look, at this stage, quite appropriate given that we're talking about fire, then I'd like to invite Maggie to unmute herself. And Maggie, would you care to just take the floor for a moment and tell us a little bit about what bushfires are seeing happening? And
yeah, so to give you some context here, I've only worked in the top end for 3 full fire seasons, mainly fighting fires around the Bachelor area and the Darwin rural area. For me, the experience is that I have fought fires in native vegetation and Gamba fires, and I guess what we're seeing is fires that are more difficult to control. They're more erratic in their behaviour and dangerous because of that. There's just more risks because of that fire behaviour. In a Gamba fire, like Nat said, they're actually quite scary to interact with compared to a native vegetation or native woodland fire. I guess over the last my time up in the top end has been going to those 2 types of fires and completely different experiences in both.
Really, I guess putting together what Natalie and Maggie have been saying, that, you know, this is an illustration of what happens with fuel. We've had this massive increase represented diagrammatically here. And then that flows through to intensity, and Natalie made that point quite strongly. And then there's other measures of the impact of fire as to how far up the trees they get charred. And here's an example illustration of that. And so these are out of a Gamba grass roots report, which is available.
Dave, can I just speak to that slide?
Yes, sure.
That was from the work we did with Sam Setterfield. The reason that so the flame height on the Gamba grass stops at 13. That's not because the flame height was 13. It's because the tree height. We're measuring them on trees, and that was the highest that the flames could be measured. We actually think the flame heights go well and truly above that. But it's really difficult to measure. Once you get beyond the height of the trees, it's really difficult to measure. So, yeah, the scary fire is very fast moving, and well and truly, the flames can totally combust all living material on the tree because the flames are so hot.
When I was working with my CDU students with Lindsay Hutley's fire experiments in Howard Springs area, we noticed that in a native grass fire in the normal savanna, as soon as they can smell the smoke, the tree frogs will come out of the leaf litter and go up the trees. While the flames are still, or maybe 20, 30, maybe 50 metres away, tree frogs will smell the smoke and go up the trees to safety. It's no longer to safety now that we have Gamba grass. So we're not only going to lose the trees, we're going to lose all the things that live in them and rely on them for shelter from fires as well with this Gamba grass.
Yeah, so another thing that we are seeing, or experience that we're seeing when we respond to fires in the late dry season and in the early dry season, we're seeing exactly what is happening in this slide. We're seeing entire areas just being consumed because of the Gamba fuel and intensity, and these fires completely kill everything in its path in front of our eyes over and over again.
And Maggie, have you got any comment about the implications of that from a financial perspective? I mean, clearly, these big fires cost more to manage. There's more standby costs, all that sort of thing. So, would you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so my colleague put together some statistics on it, Mark Gardner, in 2018, and he based the statistics on our level of preparedness for fire ban days. So during a heightened day of fire danger, we put crews together and resources available ready in case there's a fire, because we know there's an increased chance there's going to be one. And during those days, we'll be spending about $15,000 during the week, up to $18,000 on the weekend, just to have that team ready to go in case of an event. But that was the 2018, and it's probably increased since then.
Dave, it's Andy, can I just quote a fiery who made a comment for me to pass on in this webinar? I'm just quoting, "You can definitely feel the increased heat intensity if it's a Gamba grass fire compared to a native grass or woodland fire. Firefighting tactics have to change with Gamba grass because of this. The high fuel load make it too dangerous to enter and use fire breaks with Gamba if Gamba is on either side of the fire break. So these areas become no-go zones due to the danger, and the fire has to be backburnt from a safer perimeter much further out. So it changes your response tactics."
Yeah, and Andy, that'll, I guess, get highlighted later on when we talk a little bit about buffers on properties and whatever, and that sort of the issue about intensity of fires and the capacity to manage fires is just huge when it comes to small-scale properties. So, Deborah, if you could perhaps unmute yourself and introduce yourself. I mean, Deborah's basically representing the tourism interest, particularly in Litchfield area, where Gamba is a huge issue. So, Deborah, over to you to tell us a little bit about that, please.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Deborah Moyle, I'm Secretary for the Litchfield Regional Tourism Association. We represent 50 paid members and about 200 enterprises that surround or depend upon the iconic Litchfield National Park for their livelihood. One of those people is Rob Wood, who is, I believe, a co-speaker in this particular segment. Our strategic #1 priority. Many people do not realise is in fact the most visited and popular tourism attraction in the entire Northern Territory. What astounds us as an association is why it hasn't received the level of profile, promotion and certainly support in its biggest enemy. We consider Gamba enemy #1, and it's only going to get worse because people are going to die if this thing isn't kept under control. And we've often wondered, what is it going to take for a coordinated and appropriately resourced and long-term plan to be implemented by all stakeholders at the same table. We've counted at least 5 government departments involved in the control of Gamba, and I think, albeit their best efforts, we're not getting the outcomes that are needed or wanted, and there's got to be a better way. Rob Wood is on the ground. Perhaps, Rob, you might want to mention what you're actually seeing on the ground as you visit Litchfield National Park with your patrons.
Yeah, at this stage, I mean, when we go for our normal tours, we don't actually interact a great deal with Gamba directly. If you want to step off the main paths of, say, Florence or Wongai or whatever, and do a bit of bushwalking or four-wheel driving or whatever you want to do, then, you know, you're limited there, obviously, with, you know, the spread of Gamba and all the rest of it. So the threat of fire really sort of slows that down a bit. Introduce a lot more, you know, many of the speakers already mentioned the safety aspect of that, and we can't really, in good conscience and reliability at the very least of things, take people out in the bush if there's concern there about fire. The fact that you've got enough people running around starting fires when they shouldn't really makes it even more dangerous for us to offer anything out in the more remote areas.
Originally, when the park was first gazetted in the early 90s, there was no Gamba in the park at all. In the early 2000s, we started to notice the Gamba growing in a lot of the gravel pits adjacent to the Litchfield Park Road.
We undertook surveys in 2010 and 2014, and that's given us information on not just where the weed is, but also how fast it's been spreading. And at the moment, we can see that 18% of Litchfield National Park is actually infested with this weed. We've used data that we collected on the biology of the plant and also the patterns of spread from the past to develop a model that predicts where we're all spread to in the future. And this model predicts that by 2040, if there's no major management of Gamba grass, it will have invaded about half of Litchfield National Park. This includes the very important tabletop area, which includes iconic areas for tourists to visit.
Deborah or Rob, could you just spend a minute or so just talking about what you see some of the solutions to actually the question of Gamba grass in places like Litchfield?
As the top priority for our association, in the interest of our members and those others that depend on the livelihood and the lifeblood of Litchfield National Park, a coordinated approach and it's appropriately resourced. We're looking to host a stakeholders meeting. So we've identified 5 government departments, but there are others. And I think each of these departments are doing their best, but they're not doing it in a coordinated way. It appears they're operating in a silo, and they don't know what the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing, which is a waste of resources. This issue is now fairly high on the political agenda. We're getting some traction in this space, I believe, through the people from Grassroots Gamba. We've come on board as a tourism voice and a business impact, jobs impact, livelihood impact. This is a very real threat. Absolutely the way to go is a coordinated approach.
Okay.
Get everybody at the same table, and we're going to initiate that. That's how important we think this is.
Look, I'd like to jump to Andrew Spiers as a representative of the landholder in the near Darwin area.
Thanks, Dave. Helen and I bought a 200-acre property on the Darwin River, 2002, as a private conservation reserve, basically. And when we were looking to buy it, I got several people to help me look at it and assess it for weeds. Essentially, they all decided that it was pretty much a weed-free block in 2002. In 2006, we had a big fire came through the district, and after that, we had just had Gamba everywhere. Gamba and mission grass. Mission is another problem we have, but we had Gamba all through the block, and and only a very few years after that, maybe a couple of years after that, I was starting to detect what I would call fairly large monocultures. What I'm calling a large monoculture in my property is probably only 1 or 2 acres of it together, but that's still a big area for me to control by myself. And I started off doing most of this by foot. I'd carry a backpack on my back and go in and spray what I could. There you can see the property. Darwin on the right. There's the Gamba starting to get established in some of our woodland. That's about when you need to be finding this stuff and spraying it before it produces seed. You can see how much taller than the native grasses this grass is. So I started off doing it on foot from my fire truck, as you can see on the left. Eventually, I had to save up a lot of money and buy a specialised vehicle, which you can see on the right. Because my block is 2/3 swampland, then it's either wading through the swamp in my Wellington boots, which I do, but also I could, the Argo that I bought, I could get a whole lot of herbicide close to where I had to walk to, and I could get in there and get it earlier. So really, until I got that specialised equipment, I really wasn't in a position to make any headway against the invasion of this plant. Now I am making headway, and I'm making it a rare species. I've actually eradicated it from probably a half of the block, and I'm chasing it down in the rest. You have to get every last plant, or you'll be back to square one in a couple of years. So as a landowner, it's going to cost you a lot of money to control this plant. The big problem has been the worry of fire and tree death. Even without Gamba on the property, frequent fire has destroyed, since I bought the property, frequent fire has destroyed 2/3 of the tree canopy. That's horrendous. This must be happening right across the top end. And I mean, after 7 years, I finally got a house on the place. I immediately had to protect the house with various devices to keep the tree rats out of the roof. They were chewing my wiring, etc. I don't have any tree rats now because fires have basically destroyed the habitat. Now, where did the fires come from? The fires came from arsonists around the place, people just lighting fires. They also came from the fact that as soon as there was a fire anywhere near my place, the bushfires would burn my place, make sure that my place burnt, because that was the safer option than letting the fire get into my neighbours' places that have Gamba. So I was in this paradoxical situation where I was controlling the Gamba, but I was copping the fires because they were trying to keep it out of places. So now, having got to this picture that you can see on your screen, in the last 2 years, I have noticed that we have a disease in our Gamba. And you can see that it deforms stems, and I found this year that in some plants it was deforming the stems to the point where they didn't produce seed. So I've sent some specimens of these into the plant pathology branch of the government. Hope that they can identify what this pathogen is and perhaps utilise it as a biological.
Andrew, sorry, it's Natalie. Can I just jump in there? That's really exciting news. There's actually a federal government project at the moment. They're putting Gamba grass up, nominating it for biocontrol and biocontrol agent. So I know that at the moment they're really looking for people who have noticed disease on Gamba. So I think it would be great if you got in touch with the NT Weeds branch, because I think they're coordinating some of that.
Oh yes, yes. No, they know about this. I'm very pleased to hear that they're thinking about biological control. But really, to eradicate Gamba, you've got to get every last plant and biological. And we do have to eradicate it because just controlling it is not going to be enough to keep it under control for a long time.
Andrew, that's a really good position to actually move on to the next part of the presentation about this question of actually really, what's required to really get on top of Gamba. And you've really made a most important point there about actually you've got to get rid of every last plant in your property. And of course, the bigger question then is what happens on a regional scale. So I'll just perhaps pose that question at the moment. What I'd like to do now is actually to run a video about some of that we pre-recorded with Roni from the Weeds branch. All right, so for this next segment, we're really lucky. We've got Roni Opden from the Weed Management branch. So Roni looks after compliance and planning in the branch. Briefly, could you touch on some of the measures that landholders can do to actually manage Gamba on their property?
Yeah, certainly. So there's a few ways to manage Gamba. It's a grass. So, when there's a small amount of plants, people who've only got a scattering of plants, maybe through their bushland, we would definitely recommend that they have a go at hand pulling Gamba. It's got quite a shallow root. It's got a big base, but a shallow root. It's not too hard to hand pull isolated plants in the wet season. People who've got a lot of Gamba, like a wall of Gamba around their perimeter or something. So temporary measures, people can slash, graze, burn it off. They're good techniques for getting rid of the bulk of Gamba, but they don't kill Gamba. So they're temporary measures that people are going to have to keep doing for years if they choose those, slashing, burning and grazing. To actually kill Gamba, you need to either get it out of the ground without spreading the seeds, or spray it with a registered poison. So part of the herbicide program is glyphosate as the registered herbicide for Gamba grass. Very effective, and it needs to be sprayed while it's actively growing, which is in the wet season. Removing the bulk and then actually cleaning up what's left with herbicide or hand pulling or whatever you... Yeah, absolutely. And from a strategy perspective, you can have a very heavy core infestation and then it spreads outwards away from the core. The most effective way to clean up is to start on the outskirts, get those smaller plants that have escaped, round them up, bring them in, and then attack your main core infestation with all your might for a few years. So that's the old weed principle of treat the outliers. Absolutely. And work back to the core. Yeah, it's a strategic way to manage weeds. Start at the outside, work your way inwards. Otherwise, if you keep putting all your resources into the guts of it, you're going to have plants just keep escaping and getting further and further away. Now, that works at a property scale. Individual properties can work their way inwards. It also works on a landscape scale. So when we're planning bigger projects across the landscape, that's how we approach weed management as well, is looking for those outliers, putting a fair bit of resources into getting out to those individual plants to make sure they don't become big infestations. During the wet season, we run the Gamba Action Program, which is an outreach program for the community where we make assistance and support available for rural landholders. Through the Gamba Action Program, residents can come, who are trying to deal with their gamba grass, can come and get an allocation of free herbicide from the weeds branch, and they can also borrow large equipment from us. A lot of people just can't afford the big equipment they need to tackle gamba grass on their blocks.
Yeah, and obviously that's sensible use of resources rather than everybody having to own their own.
Absolutely. So we maintain some really massive quick spray units, and we've got smaller slip-on units that go on vehicles. So that program's really popular. We get about 2,000 landholders each year who come and seek support from us.
Yep.
And that's been running for over 10 years. We've been running that program, and it's been quite successful in the sense that the people who are aware of gamba grass, who know what it is and they're ready to take action, there's an outlet for them. There's support available. It also means they can come and have a chat, talk about how to plan for the best outcomes on their property. They can get the best advice. And we just get to meet a lot of people in the community. We get to hear what they're thinking, how they're going, and we learn a lot from them as well. That program's going to continue because it's really popular. We get a lot of good feedback. And what we see is that where people are using it, it gives them a sort of a story to talk to their neighbours about. And it's a positive story. They can say, hey, I got this help, you can too.
Clearly, a lot of what you've been talking about so far sounds like it's actually fairly voluntary in nature. But of course, part of the background of Gamba is that there's some legislative requirements as well. So can you tell us a bit about what actually are the responsibilities of landholders under the Act, how the legislation comes to play in terms of Gamba, please?
Yeah, certainly. So to start at the start, Gamba grass is a declared weed, and under the Weeds Management Act, all landholders must take reasonable measures to manage declared weeds on their land. So the aims that they are obliged, all landholders must try to stop their land becoming infested, and they also must make reasonable effort to stop the weeds spreading off their land. So a lot of it's about containment and reducing. So that's broadly what landholders are required to do. When it comes to gamba grass, there's a statutory weed management plan for gamba grass. Under the Act, everyone must comply with a weed plan if there's one in place. So the Gamba plan has been developed to get a lot more specific about what landholders must do in each situation. And it depends where you are, and it depends what your land is used for and the size of your land. There are 2 management zones in the Northern Territory for gamba grass. We've got the outskirts of Gamba beyond, south of Katherine, through Kakadu National Park, are what we call a Class A zone, and that is the areas where there's only a light scattering of gamba and it's feasible to eradicate. So in those areas, everyone must make an attempt to eradicate gamba. The majority of the top end falls within the Class B control zone, which means that there's so much gamba currently that eradication is not feasible, but landholders must take efforts to contain and control it on their own properties. At a minimum, this means making sure that there's no gamba grass growing for 15 metres around all the property boundaries, around the infrastructure, and also along tracks and roads. So by keeping it off your boundary, what that does is it creates a bit of space between neighbours. It also creates a greater opportunity for the fireys to attend if there's a bushfire, and it creates a better opportunity for landholders to have an escape route if they happen to be in a heavily infested area that has bushfire come through. The idea of keeping it off your tracks and roads is to prevent the spread of gamba grass through human-assisted means, and the idea of keeping it away from your infrastructure is just to protect life and property, because as we know, gamba grass can contribute to huge bushfires that burn really intense and really hot.
Lots of people you're dealing with are cooperative and are really keen to do the best they can to manage their land. But clearly there's going to be an occasional person who is less cooperative, needs a bit more encouragement to get involved in managing gamba. So what happens in that scenario?
All right, Dave, we have the Weeds Branch runs a targeted compliance program specifically for gamba grass in the rural area. We started with a desktop risk assessment of gamba grass and private land across the whole NT. We worked out there were about 49,000 properties affected by gamba grass. Through that, we've narrowed into an area of hotspots, and this is where there's lots of people living, lots of gamba grass, right? These are our targets for compliance. This is where we say, you can't just voluntarily rely on people to do it. We need to actively get in there and take action. So what we do is a program of, we start with a series of roadside assessments. We do about almost 1,500 roadside risk assessments of targeted properties. That then allows us to prioritise our efforts into about 150 of the worst blocks each year. So we take these people through a process. It's a pyramid of compliance, starting with education, going all the way through to enforcement. What that usually means is that we'll make contact with the landowner or the person who's living on the block and give them education, offer them support, offer them advice. If they choose not to take that education and advice, we can then escalate and issue the person with an order. So it's like a work order to control their gamba in accordance with the gamba plan, and we give them a time frame which is usually about 6 weeks or so, reasonable time frame to get the work done. If people don't follow the order and do the work as they're required, or if they don't make an effort to do it, we can then issue a fine, an infringement notice, and they are currently about $277 for an individual and just over $1,200 for a company. So a fine can be issued, and often that threat of a fine is, in just about every case, that's enough that people take action, which is good to see. Now, in a case, we all know that issuing a fine won't get rid of gamba. So we also have other options for compliance, which include sending contractors on to undertake the work and recovering the costs. And in extreme cases, we can actually put a restriction on the land use and put it on the land title so that the owner must clean up before they're actually allowed to do anything further, sell their land, subdivide, things like that. So we've got a few, it's a staged approach from education right through to the heavy-handedness if required. And we follow it like a pyramid, meaning that most people respond well to education, only very few we have to take right through to the top of the compliance pyramid.
So if people want to get in contact with the Weeds Branch, what's the best way for them to do that?
We've got a pretty simple email address, which is just weedinfo@nt.gov.au. We're in Palmerston. If people ever want to drop in and grab a few brochures off us or just have a chat about their own situation as well.
Yeah, okay. Well, thanks very much, Roni. It's been great to have you as part of this webinar.
Thanks, Dave.
Yeah, so there was a bit of a story from Weeds Branch. Where I'd like for us to go next is actually for Natalie to come back on and tell us a little bit about what the research that she and others have been doing is telling us, is informing us about the way forward.
I now want to just talk about how research can inform gamba management. So I should have entitled this talk, "There is some good news," because so much of what we do is being about documenting impacts and looking at, trying to quantify the potential risks, but there is some good news. So our research over the last 20 years has helped us understand lots about gamba biology. So this actually helps management target weaknesses in the plant. So the good news is that gamba is actually highly controllable with relatively cheap herbicide. So when you look at other weeds, like things like mimosa, or even things like, what's a good example, siamweed or aquatic weeds, they are much more difficult to control. So in reality, gamba is not a mythical, magical plant. It is actually highly controllable. It does have a large seed production, so that's not great. But the good news is that the seed longevity, so how long that seed remains viable, is really short. So it's only a year. So that's really good news too. So we're not looking at something like mimosa, which the seeds remain viable in the soil for 50 years. We've only got one year where the majority of seeds will remain viable. So that means you only have to manage one area. So you'd have to come back sort of 2 or 3 years and you should be right. But that is the good news. But you really need to get in early to stop large infestations and save dollars and to make it easier to manage. Once you've got a landscape scale infestation, of course it's going to be difficult. That's hard. If you get in early, it's much easier. So researchers also help map the distribution of Gamba, as I always say. So this helps inform management. You can't manage what you don't know. So even think about now with coronavirus, they're testing because they want to know where it is. Because unless they know where it is, they can't manage it. So it is the same thing with weeds. You can't manage it unless you know where it is. So this is an example of the work that Sam Setterfield and Vanessa Adams did, and these were from the 2 helicopter surveys that they did in Litchfield National Park. There was one in 2010, another one in 2014. But you can see with the red areas that it spread really, rapidly in those, between those two and those years. That's helpful because, again, it helps you understand where it is, where you need to prioritise your management, and it helps you understand when it's going to impact on your assets. So whether that's environmental assets, cultural assets, tourism assets, so you can put more money towards those things. So as I said, mapping is really important. It's really, it is the first key step if you're going to try and manage Gamba grass at a landscape level. So that's good. We know where it is and we're about to get a better understanding of where it is now. I'm sure the news is not going to be great, but again, that should help inform management. Our research has also provided evidence of the severity of the impacts and also the costs. It was really important for us to put costs on, particularly things like the cost for fire management. So, for example, when we looked at the grass fire cycle, it's clear that the main impacts of Gamba are due to fire. So this helps us focus on that impact and try and reduce that impact. When we've costed out different management scenarios, so we also looked at the evidence of the increased fire costs. Now, we've done that a couple of times with Bushfires NT. The most recent time was in 2017. So what this shows, we've got a map of Litchfield and the Greater Darwin area. So there was a period in, I think it was August in 2017, where there was a run of really large Gamba fires. So over a 5-day period, in just those little purple areas that you can see on the screen, there were 5 Gamba grass wildfires, and it cost in the order of somewhere between $300,000 to $350,000 to manage those fires. So one individual fire on its own for one day actually cost $100,000. So we've actually published these results, so I'm happy to pass on the papers. So big cost to manage those Gamba grass fires. So in comparison, it would be expected that native grass fires in those areas would have used to cost between $2,000 and $9,000 to manage. So it's a massive increase in costs of fire management, and you've got to understand that you're going to be looking at these large costs in a reoccurring basis. Unless we see some large reduction in Gamba grass cover, we're going to be seeing these really large costs every single year. So the other option would be put a large amount of money into controlling Gamba, and then it might just be a large investment on a much shorter period. That might be a simplistic option, but it would mean that you wouldn't be putting in large amounts of money every single year. So that's good, we know where Gamba is and what the impacts and costs are, but research can actually help inform management into the future. So if we just look at the ideas of eradication and control. So at the moment with eradication, we can really learn from the success that they're having in Western Australia. They had a small Gamba grass infestation on Equestro. WA Parks developed a really successful plan. So the idea was to find and control all those Gamba individuals. So to do that, they did aerial surveys and also on-ground surveys, so going out there and literally walking lines to find the Gamba and then controlling it. So it sounds pretty simple. There's actually a lot of time and effort and money to do that, but they are actually well on their way to declaring Gamba eradicated from Equestro. So if you think in comparison, we've had 10 years that the eradication zone in the NT has been declared. I'm really not sure, how much progress that we've made. So if we're talking about removing all of the Gamba in that eradication zone, I think we should be doing a similar scenario, surveying all the areas that we can, ground surveying, and actually doing the control. So moving on to control, there is also, if you're in the control zone in the NT, there's also evidence-based that management can reduce impacts. So we've been doing some work with the Mary River Rangers on Wildman Reserve, and they had the idea that if Gamba loves fire, what would happen if they started reducing that fire frequency? So they started excluding fire from some of the Gamba sites and did it for a number of years. And we've actually measured what's happened at those sites. So the Gamba has actually reduced by 50% on some of those sites just because of the reduction in fire. And not only that, the density of trees has actually increased by 50%. So here you have the opposite of the grass fire cycle. You have Gamba declining, trees improving, and that's because they've reduced that fire frequency. Now that won't work everywhere. You need to have really good breaks and you need to manage that area really intensively. It's not a do-nothing option, but it's really exciting to see that reducing fire frequency can have such good results. So on Mary River, they've also been doing large amounts of spraying. Again, they're trying to break up the Gamba landscape like this, so that track through the middle of that used to be Gamba. So they're each year just trying to do a little bit more. They're doing some aerial spraying, trying to really protect those important seed trees, some of the milkwoods. And the exciting thing is that areas that were once 4 metre high walls of Gamba are now actually looking much better. So there's still a long way to go. These were very badly damaged sites, but reducing the fire frequency and removing the Gamba, they're starting to see tree recruitment again. The seed trees, the older seed trees, are still there, so the recruitment is starting to happen. What they're also seeing is something that I didn't actually think was possible, but in this case, so on the left, that's a photo from my honours in 2001 on Mary River Reserve, and that's an area on the park. On the right is the exact same spot in 2019. So they've gone from a really dense Gamba infestation back to a woodland by, in this case, reducing fire frequency, and they were also spraying the Gamba. So it's been a lot of work, but they've really worked hard at it, and the rangers at Mary River are doing a fantastic job. So it's proof that Gamba management can be cost effective and successful. So we're really hoping to see into the future, we're hoping to see that more sites like this, maybe different areas can trial out reducing just a little bit of that fire frequency and seeing what happens. If anyone wants to contact me, I'm happy to, if you contact me, I'm happy to have a chat about the results further. Thanks, Dave.
I mean, yeah, obviously some fantastic news, and I mean that last image about how the site's changed in the Mary River area. That's very heartening to see. We've seen some quite dramatic things, potentially dramatic things happen in the last few months. I mean, we've had the post-COVID sort of economic recovery. Even the idea of a Gamba grass army has been floated. We've even in the last few days, we've had one of the major political parties in the NT make an announcement about their direction they want to head with Gamba grass. We've had the weed management branch have actually put together a weed advisory committee, which is a really diverse group of people representing a range of different organisations, and they've done a whole lot of planning, and I guess I'll come back to that in a minute. Does anybody else on the panel have a particular comment as to where they see the momentum going at the moment?
I'd like to talk about Kakadu. I had a look at the plan of management, which is the current one, which runs for quite a long time, yet in terms of what they're going to do about weed management, in particular Gamba, of course. And I'll quote the line which took my attention in particular, and that was that in the face of limited resources, future weed management in Kakadu will need to focus on priority areas of the park. But as we know, and as we saw on the maps earlier, there's very little Gamba grass in Kakadu yet. It's well and truly manageable if they put their heart and soul and money into it. So what I'd suggest here is that there really needs to be some public activism happen. And I'd like to see organisations like Top End Native Plants and Northern Territory Natural History Society, Gamba Roots, ECNT, all you guys, to write individually to the Federal Minister for the Environment and lobby through these umbrella organisations, which obviously represent large numbers of people. And obviously those letters would need to be copied to the departmental head of the Department of Environment and also to the Federal Director of National Parks, to sort of raise the idea in their minds that there's community angst about what's going on in Kakadu in terms of management issues, particularly Gamba, because it's not too late in Kakadu. They can do it. They did it with Mimosa, which is a fantastic project. They got in early and they've been able to keep on top of Mimosa on the wetlands. Well, Gamba is basically Mimosa in the woodlands. And if anything, the effects could be even more devastating with Gamba grass than with Mimosa on the wetlands. They've got to be dragged into the public arena and forced to act on Gamba grass before it's too late.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Greg. And yeah, look, clearly, yeah, we're hearing yet again from Greg there about the need to actually let your views be known. Just on thinking of that question of push, what happens with Gamba grass, we're currently right at the end of the current Gamba grass management program that's been adopted under NT legislation. That ran from 2010 to 2020. And they've actually done a lot of consultation with various interest groups around the top end. Sometime, not quite sure when, but sometime in the next few months, it's likely that management program will actually go out for public comment. And I'd really encourage people that that's an ideal time to actually put in your 2 bobs worth about what needs to be done in regards management of Gamba. And I think I'll just come back to something that was, I guess, perhaps not raised in exactly these terms earlier in this webinar, but has been raised about what's actually practical to do, and the question about containment versus eradication. And clearly from what Greg was just saying, I mean, eradication in Kakadu is quite achievable. And so we've got those sort of opportunities that we can really seize, and undoubtedly having some wins like that, and there have been some great wins, but publicising those wins and then having more wins actually will build the future about what happens with Gamba. If we think back to that very early slide I put up that had a sort of an invasion curve and a potential response, I mean, to me, we're at a crucial juncture at the moment where we really need to act very promptly to get some really good on-ground action. And certainly there are lots of landholders who are doing great on-ground action, but there's also plenty of scope for others to be doing more. Because if we let it go too long, when the job becomes just that much harder for us. All right, so perhaps if I can put it back to the panel, has anybody else got any comment in terms of the solution, or want to add anything to what I was just saying there?
Yes, Dave, it's Andrew Spiers here. I'd like to say that there's a theme running through this whole webinar. Yeah, so I would have Gamba grass eradicated on my place if people didn't keep lighting my place up. And I think we've got to look at that aspect of it very closely. And I think what Natalie talked about with the Mary River situation is part of the key to this process. We have to change the burning culture of the top end in order to achieve this. That's the other point.
Yeah, so again, I think that Mary River example is a really exciting one in the fact that it shows that by reducing fire, it's a pretty cheap thing to do, putting in really good brakes and making sure that the fire doesn't get into that Gamba grass area. It was labour intensive because they have to manage that area and try and keep the wildfires out. But essentially, it is a fairly cheap management option. But also that area that they're spraying and have had really good results with the spraying, A lot of people would have said that actually, that you should just walk away from that area and write it off. So because it's such a large, dense infestation. So I think, to me, that was something that I took home from that as well, is that regardless of your size of your infestation, you can always do something, but you've got to have what you do, modified for what your particular scenario is. They were breaking up that block and doing it piece by piece, trying to protect the trees in case the fire got in. So it was that really fine scale management, and they're having great success with it. So it's really heartening, but I think there needs to be more about trying to reduce Gamba fire frequency. We see a lot of areas in the rural area get burnt every single year with the Gamba, twice a year. There are some areas that I think get even burnt more than that. So I think it does require a change in culture. Final thing I wanted to raise is that personally, I think there needs to be a state Gamba coordinator. We used to have a national Gamba grass coordinator. It was fantastic. It was one person bringing all the stakeholders together and all the information. We had it for 1 year. We got so much done, so much more advanced than where we were, but then the federal funding dropped for that. I think a really good model would be if there was an actual state coordinator or territory coordinator for Gamba grass, again, to bring different agencies together and to be one source of information.
I have a question, and perhaps it's directed towards you, Natalie. We keep touching on this lack of coordination. It's an issue that I raised. Clearly, you're speaking to that point. Where does the messaging come from for each of the 5 government departments that I've recognised, none of which are federal? And how can, other than you mentioned a state Gamba grass coordinator, I wrote it down, great idea, very much needed. So where is the messaging coming from? Why is it not coordinated? Is that too difficult a question to answer?
Look, I'm not sure, as I couldn't speak for the government, but I think definitely, I think different agencies, there are slightly different goals that they're aiming to achieve, and I think there are reasons for that, because they're trying to address, what their department has to address. But I think this is where the state territory coordinator could help bring the different agencies together and help align the different goals with the one overall goal, which is actually to do with the statutory plan, the Gamba grass plan. I've been watching the fires on NAFI for the last couple of days. Even last night, I was watching how awful those Gamba fires were at Bachelor. And look, fire is always a controversial issue. I think Gamba grass just makes it more difficult. So I think that coordinator role is going to be really key.
Andy, did you have anything else that you wanted to pass on from chat, or the messages for the webinar?
A fiery has, before the webinar, asked me to pass on another comment, which was that it's like a fire cycle, which we've already been alluding to with Gamba, that seems to perpetuate Gamba spread. And for example, when they have to respond to a Gamba wildfire, they have no choice but to burn from around the outside perimeter to protect neighbouring properties, and then that increases, builds a huge fire. So we're sort of stuck in this cycle that in wildfire response, we have to act such as to really favour the continuing spread of Gamba. It's like we're locked into this cycle at the moment. And I suspect, he didn't mention this, but I suspect it's also the case with prescribed burning, controlled burning, that we end up spreading Gamba inadvertently because of the cycle that we're into with fire. Any comment on that, Natalie?
Yeah, look, we really do think that working with fire frequency is one of the key ways to manage Gamba. We need to understand what is actually causing that fire to improve Gamba competitiveness.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Natalie.
Greg here for a comment on that.
Yep. Fine, Greg.
I'm just about to bring out a book on fire in the top end, and basically my opinion of all that's wrong with it. My main emphasis is to try to get a bigger switch from early dry season burning amongst speargrass country move towards early wet season burning, because that way, as many of you will know, you knock out the annual grasses. It's also very useful in helping with gamba control to burn in the early wet season, because the fires are not so ferocious, because obviously there's been rain and a lot of the vegetation is wet, and you pick your time as well. But by getting rid of all the dead matter, it provides much better access to get into a weed infested area. And also, when the gamba grass is regrowing because of the rain happening at that time of year, it's much more sensitive to glyphosate. It's very easy to kill it with a very small volume of chemical compared to doing it, say, in the early dry season if it hadn't been burnt before. And so I see more wet season burning being much more useful in helping with the control of weeds, perennial weeds and annual weeds for that matter, than what early dry season burning does.
Yeah, okay, thanks for that comment, Greg. And that, I guess, also highlights another thing that's been raised today is the question about actually doing things a bit different, and the real need for a big change in the way we do things. Okay, so we've had some great ideas and lots of great information this afternoon, and in a moment I'll launch into a little summing up of what I think we've covered. But before we do that, one of the striking things to me that's happening is we've had this movement in momentum, and given that Mitch Hart is involved with a lot of community action, I've just asked Mitch to give us a few comments about what his perception of where momentum stands in our community in regards to Gamba.
Sure, thanks, Dave. And I think that momentum is clear, that the community's been responsible for getting Gamba out of the too hard basket. And I think that's a direct result of more and more Territorians actively pushing for solutions to deal with the Gamba crisis that's affecting people's lives and lifestyle. And supporters have done things like write letters to the NT News, send messages on radio, and even had politicians visiting their block to show them the reality of the Gamba crisis on the ground. And the good news is it's working across the political spectrum. We've seen plans for eradication on Crown land, and the concept of a Gamba army described as hugely popular. And that's all because of you. And that's those community efforts, whether it's a volunteer firey, an Aboriginal ranger, a landholder, or just somebody who cares about the Territory's future doing their best to fight Gamba. It's because of people like that that make this a reality. So we know how much you put in to reduce the risk of Gamba fires, but now we need to see that matched by political will and resources to get the job done.
So where I'd like to just jump back a little bit and start with Y-Act, and I guess what we're, well, not I guess, I know what we're seeing in the top end is that Gamba grass is still spreading, which tells me that the current response is not enough. And as we've heard today, there's huge issues about changing the top end landscapes, effectively destroying a whole lot of habitats. There's huge issues about fire. There's clearly the danger to person and property. There's a whole lot of issues about increasing fire response costs, and then there's big impact on livelihood. So we're threatening the whole industry. So whether it's carbon farming, whether it's tourism in places like Litchfield National Park, then livelihoods are really under threat from Gamba grass. So that's the Y-Act. At the beginning of this webinar, we said that one of the things we wanted to focus on was solutions. And so where I'd like to start with that is actually ways forward for landholders. And it's an underpinning step is actually to know where your Gamba is. And then once you know what you're dealing with, well then in the wet season there's things like slashing or grazing to knock down the bulk. And there's also, most importantly, spraying in the wet season, because slashing alone isn't going to get rid of Gamba. Then there needs to be the integration of removing the bulk and also spraying. I mean, if you've just got a small amount or outliers, and hand pulling is also a possibility. An important aspect of that is that you need to keep following up until the Gamba grass is gone. You can be really strategic about it. So you can prioritise roadsides, boundaries, start with the outliers and then work in towards the centre of your infestation if it's sizable. We've had some really interesting ideas today about fire frequency and the impact on Gamba grass. And we also heard lots about support. So there's clearly weed management branch, we've got heaps to offer, but there's also great community groups out there. So there's the Gamba Grassroots and there's Protect Our Patch. So there's lots of information and support from various community groups too. And I suppose a really important point for landholders is that acting now actually is going to save a huge eradication and fire costs later on. So there's really big benefits in actually acting sooner rather than later. So it seems to me as though we've got a couple of options to going forward. We can continue on our present course, and that really what it is keeping Gamba as a low community priority, insufficient investment and leadership by government. We've got a minority of very dedicated and determined landholders taking some amazing action, but that's a minority rather than the majority. And we've got a scenario of continued spread where there seems to be an attitude at times of it's somebody else's problem. And the outcome of this option A, to continue on our present course, is that we actually pass on an unsolvable problem to future generations. It'll just be too late to act if we don't act soon. In fact, it's too late to act if we don't act now. And if we don't act now, there's just a massive opportunity cost in the future from inadequate action. Then what we really need is an aggressive strategic response led by NTG. The whole community needs to be behind it, but NTG has got a really important role to play as leaders in it. And that's so that we can pass on a healthy, economic, attractive landscape for future generations of Territorians. We need to establish Gamba as a high community priority. We need aggressive leadership by the Northern Territory Government, and that will involve significant investment. We had a really interesting idea today about a Gamba coordinator as a way of bringing agencies together. And of course, we had mention about compliance. And while, sure, the first and preferable action is for people to just be on board and voluntarily get involved with doing stuff with Gamba, there actually will be a need for compliance because there will always still be a few indifferent or absent landholders that need some encouragement. One of the things that Natalie raised earlier today was it's really hard to manage something you don't know about. And so mapping of Gamba is really important. That mapping needs to be well resourced. It needs to be done frequently enough that it provides the information required for management. In the eradication zone, we actually really do need to eradicate. And in the control zone, we really need to control. And I guess there's been lots of discussion today about targeting roadsides, outliers. Litchfield National Park come up lots. One of the other interesting things that's been raised is actually the burning regime. So the culture of burning in the NT, and it really poses a question about whether it's actually time to change the way we approach fire in the landscape. So what are the things that you can do? You can ask politicians what they will do. You can write letters. You can join community groups like Gamba Grassroots or Protect Our Patch. And these are great community on-ground organisations. So contact them to find out how you can get involved. So that gives you, if you haven't got your own little patch of Gamba to look after, or even if you have and you need extra support, then there's, you've got work to do. Also, a big part is actually talking to neighbours if they've got Gamba. So there's a real community groundswell about it. And something for everybody, whether you're living in suburban Darwin or out on a rural block, is actually to really be careful about avoiding the spread of seed. Okay, so Mitch, over to you for a final word before we go back to Lou.
Sure, thanks, Dave. So I think there's three things that need to be done to stop the spread of Gamba at the community level, and many of these things are already being done by people, but we need to build upon that. So the three steps are, first of all, help spread the word. That means telling your friends, family and neighbours about the need to tackle Gamba both on the ground and from the government. Secondly, take responsibility, ensure that your own property is Gamba free and stays that way. And then thirdly, join the campaign, stay in the loop, by joining Gamba Grassroots and getting involved with other groups on the ground.
There's a comment that I'd like to share with everybody here, and it seems to me to be very, very appropriate to this this current situation with Gamba. And it's quite clear to me, but it's actually very uncertain, but that uncertainty actually provides us with a huge opportunity for the future. And yeah, I mean, this is just one of those famous quotes, but I think it's absolutely applicable in this situation. That definition of insanity, that doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results, is just yeah, not a way forward. Then yeah, we actually do have an amazing amount of opportunity that we just, to me, we really don't have much option but to go for, to seize that opportunity, because the alternative is just not the top end that I want to see.
Thanks everyone for tuning in, and all our panel members. To anyone tuning in, you can support the Environment Centre by becoming a Territory Guardian. That's our monthly donor program, and you can sign up to be a donor for as little as $5 a month. This allows us to put on things like this and other programs, and really campaign for a strong territory that is really active on all sorts of different environmental issues. As I said at the start, you can access this webinar through our YouTube channel. We have all of our previous webinars up there as well. Oh, okay, so if you have any future ideas or topics that you'd like us to broach, feel free to send them through. You can send them through to my email there, or get in touch via our website. We're always looking to give what people are interested in. So looking forward to hearing your suggestions. And our next webinar that we have coming up is Fire in the Top End. So we don't have a date for that yet, but as usual, you can find all of our upcoming events on our website and on our Facebook as well. If you're not signed on to our monthly e-newsletter, you can do that through our website, and then we put all of these in our monthly Turtle Times as well. Yes, thank you everyone for sharing your knowledge, and for those who tuned in, and we hope you continue tuning in.